It's going to be a huge temptation to try to pull those of you who missed part one into the whole thing, but I'm going to try to resist that temptation vigorously. If I could start with the first slide. I began last time in Rekindling the Vision Part 1 with this quotation. Heaven knows how we'll rekindle our religion, but I believe we must. 2005, Sunday paper, your famous Scottish historian, Niall Ferguson. And what he goes on to say is, I'm a hard-shelled materialist myself, I suppose. But the decline of Christianity, not just in Britain, but right across Europe, stands out as one of the most remarkable phenomena of our times. Now, why? And here we go to the next one. This is the bit, and don't miss it. You see what I was already saying about the moral inadequacy, the instability of all non-Christian thought. It is not so much the spread of such mumbo-jumbo, he's talking about the New Ages around Oxford, where he lives, that concerns me half so much as the moral vacuum our de-Christianization has created. Do you see that? Moral vacuum. And he then goes on to make the suggestion that everyone should go to church on Sunday just to be reminded of this heritage of ours. Now, dear friends, just realize what you're reading there. This provides us in the church with the greatest opportunity we have ever had. What I call the moral and intellectual bankruptcy of the modern West. Now, are we actually making use of this opportunity to come in with something which is very powerful, which has been, as it were, proved in the past? We've seen what it could do. Are we doing that? And my conclusion is that sadly we are very ill-equipped as evangelicals. And I'm going to deal now in this session very hurriedly, but please let me say it again. If you want to interrupt, please feel free to do so. I'm going to deal with two things, what I call the pietist hangover, and then the virus of technique. The pietist hangover and the virus of technique. Now, I've already, in a sense, last time dealt with the pietist hangover. This next diagram, this is a wall starting at 1500 and up to the 21st century here. And this is, in a sense, my own representation of what Schaeffer was getting at in How Should We Then Live? The book which traces the history of the relationship between Christianity and culture right back to the Greco-Roman world. But just starting in 1500 and not suggesting that there isn't anything before, of course not. I'm not doing that, but just starting here because our own culture is, I would say, best understood as the product of two revolutions. Revolution 1, the Reformation, Revolution 2, the Enlightenment, the middle of the 18th century. So 1500, 1600, 1700, there you go, beginning of the Enlightenment. Remember, I'm just sketching, and let me say this again very, very carefully. When you do this kind of thing, you're bound to make a mistake because there are all kinds of details that one can go into, etc. But I'm actually just trying to give the big picture. Do you follow me? And the point of this diagram is to show that after the Enlightenment, a way of thinking, a way of viewing reality, a worldview came into existence which was inimical to this. In fact, it saw itself quite deliberately as the undoing of all of this heritage. Do you see? Yeah. Because it was wrong. It was superstitious. And as the blue, there it goes, as the blue increases, that is the success of a humanistic, a naturalistic view of reality grows. As that happens, because of the instability inherent in that system, the whole thing starts to disintegrate. And so the wall starts to lean over. It's just an illustration, okay? Just an illustration, but it's trying to serve to show that. The red is the development of modern science, beginning with Galileo, 1609, just taking it as a rough figure. There's the rule of law established, the beginnings of our, what we call parliamentary democracy, 1642, 1648, 1668, all those are important dates. 1688, the Glorious Revolution, William III, etc. And you have all of this developed within a Christian culture. Not only Christian in a general sense, but a biblical Christian, a Bible-believing, a Reformation worldview. So science actually comes in this context. It's actually a Christian product. But as it developed, my point last time was it was hijacked by the Enlightenment. Now I realized, funny enough, just in preparation for coming up here, that I had made another mistake, like the first one, and that actually I haven't dealt with what I call the grand deception. The grand deception was what actually went on when the philosophers in the 18th century kidnapped science. How did they do it? And what was wrong with it? And how can we show what was wrong with it? The grand deception. But I'm going to have to pass over that. But this is the thrust, that science as it develops, producing more and more technology, brings us to this moment in time where we are at a point of collapse. And as I said, this blue here is what I think is supposed to represent a buttress. The only thing that keeps us afloat, has kept us afloat, is our economic prosperity. A system, an economic system, now global, but originating in the West, which if it collapses, if that goes, there is nothing that can sustain us with the vision that we have had previously, the values that we've had previously, and we will then really see a substantial collapse of the entire culture. The main focus of this diagram, however, is another little diagram on the side here, and here we come to our subject. So last time I was focusing on the external developments, and I traced out in some detail, much too sketchily, the details historically of how the ideologies like Marxism, Nazism, etc. came into existence, and a lot of other things too. But the external story is what I focused on last time. What I want to focus on now is the internal story. What has been happening within the church, particularly what has been happening to us and our heritage as evangelicals who believe the Bible. And the point of my diagram here on the side is a graph which has between 0 and 100% on the left there, an indication of the fact that the reformers had a commitment to the lordship of Christ over the whole of life. In other words, they didn't have a division between things which are church and things which are in the society. They were involved in the whole thing, and as a result of that commitment, they actually were able to change the culture, and hence the rule of law. If you ask what were these men fighting for, they were all, in my view, they're all sinners. We're all sinners. They were outstanding Bible-believing Christians who had these the vision, many of them. Likewise in the area of science. But when you look at this and you trace it up to the middle of the 19th century, and I'm taking there 1859, which is Darwin's Origin of Species, is just a rough end point. What you find is that at that critical moment, when Darwin is just coming on tap, you have this phenomenon that the evangelicals have given up on that concept of the 100% lordship of Christ over the whole of life, and they have accepted something very much narrow and I think ineffective, which is the pietist hangover. And you remember my diagram last time, it was heart, not head. I'm just putting it simply. The experiential thing, not the intellectual thing. Heart, not head. Private. My own devotional life, my own philanthropy, being kind, being a good neighbor, all good. And not public. Private, not public. Are you all with me? Okay. And I'm saying that that mentality had become common in the church, to such a degree. There were exceptions, of course, but by and large, that was where we were when the big assault arrived from the Enlightenment. And so naturally, just like I was saying in my diagram, you know, about the training, you remember, people are ill-equipped. They didn't know how to respond to this, how to deal with this, what I call the grand deception, how science had been hijacked. What do you say? See? And they then sublimated that weakness by concentrating their energies. Not that what they did was wrong by any means. They focused instead, they concentrated their energies on the missionary movement. I've just read this lovely book by J.C. Pollock, A Cambridge Movement. And it's about the story of the Kikyu arising out of Charles Simeon. Charles Simeon died in 1836 down here. And then in 1877, you had the beginning of the Kikyu. That was the beginning of the UCCF work and intervarsity around the world. Magnificent. But what happened in 1884? 1882, Moody comes to Cambridge. Big meetings, many people converted. And the big thing was become a missionary. Now, please don't misunderstand me. My mother-in-law was born in a missionary family in China. Praise God. I mean, that we need missionaries. But was that the only thing we should be doing? And one of the scholars, who's died since, who is connected with Ridley, actually did a study showing that one of the reasons why evangelicalism in the early 20th century suffered so seriously was that the vast majority of the men who were being trained took off and went to Africa or China or something. Now, not that they shouldn't do, but you see, the consideration of the intellectual, the public domain here at home was not very important. What? That's what I call the pietist hangover. Do you follow me? Now, it's no good just reacting and saying, well, we don't like that. We think that was a mistake. We run into this idea all over the place, and I've just sketched it for you. But there are those in this country who, in all seriousness, highly trained, you know, been to university, Oxbridge, most of them, who are leading very important churches in university towns, who give that impression to the people in their pews. You've become a Christian. I call it gospel only. Gospel only ministry. The really important thing is, because this whole world is dying, people are going to hell, they need to be saved. How are they saved? By hearing the word. Therefore, even though you've got an Oxbridge degree, etc., you should go into the ministry. You should become a preacher. Now again, please, you can see the difficulty of what I'm dealing with here. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be, and I did choose that myself. And I went into the ministry in L'Abri, in a sense, ordained as a Presbyterian. So I'm not talking about this being illegitimate in and of itself, far from it. But if the context is the pietist hangover, that really, that's the important thing, the private, your commitment to evangelism, mission, etc. And the external, the public, is not so important. I think we express this terrible sub-Christian theology, which, unless we deal with it, I think nothing is going to make a difference up here. I want now to look at the next diagram, which is a set of two, because it's no use our just saying, well, we realize we've made a mistake and now we're going to start a new thing. And whatever name we attach to it, we have to have a strong biblical reason for challenging the pietist hangover. In other words, for justifying our engagement in things like the Wilberforce Institute, which is going to train an economist in Africa, etc., etc. So that's my thrust. So in order to deal with this pietist hangover, we've got to be clear what spirituality, what Christian sanctification is all about. And these two diagrams, I hope, will help you to see that this is pre-fall, pre-Genesis 3, and I've got here the triune God, who creates male and female, man and woman, in his image. Now, We're all familiar with that. We're very, very familiar with that. But have we understood the real significance of this concept of the image of God? And these boxes down here are my little attempt to explain more. You've noticed I've left one blank because it's a very big concept. And anyway, we shouldn't be dividing it up as if these are disparate things. It's all part of our experience day in and day out, that we have creativity, that we are rational, moral, etc., that we have language. In all these ways, God made people, Adam and Eve, and then of course their progeny, their offspring, made them to be an expression of his own self, his own personality. They were made persons able to act in all of these ways, which were completely unique in terms of the creation. Now you might say, well, what about the angels? And the angels are persons, yes, but the angels are not made the image of God. And there's another, we could unpack that further. But the point I'm trying to make here is, in describing all of these things, these are what we would just call ordinary human experience. There's nothing exceptional about this. But this actually was the perfect experience that God intended for the image of God, was to include all of these things. So, for example, they had language, and then they were given the responsibility to name the animals. And then they were responsible for the garden. They had the relationship with each other, a relationship of love, unique in the world, in the universe. And so, at this time, when there was no Bible, no evangelism, no prayer meetings, no church, it was all fine. It was absolutely perfect. Then you have the fall, the rebellion against God, and you have a barrier which is insurmountable, cannot be penetrated by human beings, which is sin, and God then comes and provides us with the solution. And only through Christ can there be a return to a relationship with the living God. Now, my point in the diagram is, okay, so what about these boxes? And I haven't put the names in all of them, but you get the point. The point of the diagram is to say that the image was distorted, but not completely obliterated. And the whole purpose of salvation after Christ's coming is in fact seen in the Bible as the restoration of all of these. So that if I could do this, manipulate them right now, and slowly get them back into the shape in which they were, creativity, emotions, rationality, etc., that would be the point of you and myself becoming Christians and following Jesus. That we become more like him. And who is he? He is the image himself. He is in the likeness of the Father. So to become more and more Christ-like. But Christ-like in what way? Well, involving himself, let's say, in going to a wedding. And they had wine there. And he sure knew what was going on in the political world around him, just as Paul did. I was reading 2 days ago with some others the account of Paul in Philippi. And you remember when the earthquake took place and they're going to be released and the jailer says, what must I do to be saved? You remember the next bit? He doesn't just walk out. He says, oh, those public officers who are doing something unrighteous, unjust, they've got to come and apologize and escort us publicly out of town. What's that if it isn't a public statement? Do you understand? You see, in all of these ways, you see, it was a public experience and not just a private experience. They were engaged in the whole of life. This dotted line up here is to represent the fact that even the physical, hear me carefully, even the physical is going to be restored. That's why we say the creed. The resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Do you believe that? I mean, that's what God is going to do. He's going to restore. In my view, the trees are going to clap their hands when that wonderful moment comes. And Revelation 11, verse 18, when Jesus comes to destroy the destroyers of the earth. You destroyed my beautiful creation. I am going to restore it. So you see where I'm going with this. That the image of God is our guiding principle. As we read the whole Bible, we realize that while it is fallen, the whole of reality is fallen, Jesus came not to start something brand new, sort of completely unrelated to what existed before, but to actually restore it. And we must be involved in that. So what we find in Jesus' teaching is as much a concern for those who are sick physically as for those who are sick spiritually. Do you see? And he says, listen, who are the sheep and the goats? Well, I was in prison. Where were you? Do you see what I'm saying? It isn't this division between the spiritual and then the secular. There's that unity. This diagram, I hope it will be helpful to you. Another way I put it is that we talk a great deal about the Great Commission, and rightly we emphasize it, that we are called to go out into the world to preach the gospel. But actually we should, in our minds, always think, well, actually, biblically, there are two Great Commissions, because the Great Commission is not a biblical term. There are two Great Commissions. And the Great Commission that is already present is that we have been made in the image of God, and we are called to restore that image. And hence the cup of cold water to the person who's thirsty. Helping the little lady who's got great need, who's our neighbor, etc. Do you follow? Now this, I think, is absolutely vital. And as part of this, just to relate it to what I was talking about earlier, you see, for me to encourage someone to become a PhD who's really clear as an economist about how God's truth relates to economics, and to everything else, of course, is not something which is irrelevant, as if the only thing that this particular individual could do that was really worthwhile would be to give up his economics and then become an evangelist. So that's what I'm talking about, the pietist hangover. We really have to deal with that. I'm now going to move on to the second. And when I get to the second thing, the virus of technique, what I'm getting at is this. I'm not talking about technology. That's why I've used this word very deliberately, the virus of technique. We've talked about this weakness, the pietist hangover. Last time in part A, I explained where the pietists had come from, so if you want to go back and hear that, you can. But now I'm going to deal with another problem which actually has carried on parallel, coming up like this. So here's the pietist hangover, and here, sadly, my dear friends, we had a double whammy. By the double whammy, I mean there was another influence at work to weaken us in relation to our culture. That's what I mean by the virus of technique. Where did it come from? If you take this period here, the beginning of the 19th century, you have, along with the pietist hangover, you have the development of technology in a big way. This is the Industrial Revolution. And that transformed our entire world. I mean, my father is 102. He was born in 1906. And if you just picture what happened in his life from when he was, a little boy, and then rode in the first car that came to town and so on and so forth. I mean, just imagine what has happened. And I think what I feel has happened is that the church, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around here, and then right on up, never understood that while technology is in itself neutral, it's not sinful, it's not evil in and of itself. Right. In fact, the word techne in Greek is the word art, and you can feel the connection here, just what we have made, what we've created, when you have the word artifact, you see. So technology refers to this whole thing, but in the Industrial Revolution, science had enabled us to develop a tool of extraordinary power. That's why Francis Bacon wrote his book in 1620 called the Novum Organum. That's why he's so famous. Francis Bacon wrote this book, and he said, there is a new tool. He meant science. He didn't see much of the technology, but he knew it was coming. And he actually said, this is what is going to give us solutions to our problems, the practical problems, which of course it did. Amazing solutions. I mean, I'm taking a medicine every day, and you probably are too, which has helped me so much. Just a tiny little thing, doesn't have any side effects. Man, I take that, and I'm really thankful to God for this. This is a result of technology. So we're not talking about technology per se. Do you follow me? The fridge, whatever else, the computer. We are actually talking about how it affected the society as a whole. That's what I mean by the virus of technique. Because what we can do, we can make two mistakes. We can either see the complexity of what life has become as a result of technology, and then rubbish it, say that it actually is the problem, the computer, the automobile. And that is what's called Luddism, because in the early 19th century, in fact, I just read the other day Charlotte Bronte's book, Shirley. One of the main features in that, her father, who was a graduate of Cambridge, had actually run into this in his first parish. There were actually Luddites going around smashing the machines that came into the factories, do you see? And so she dwells on that. So we can either make that mistake, which is a foolish mistake, and it's very unbiblical, because there's nothing wrong with us creating something. In the same way, that's what I've been talking about already. You paint a picture, make a beautiful flower arrangement, make a dress, and so on and so forth. All of that is fine, and technology is fine. But it isn't. And the second mistake is to disregard the influence, the way it changes everything. We have failed to realize that Neil Postman has a very helpful term here, that it's not simply an addition to our life, whatever the technology is. He calls it an ecology. That the technology actually then gets into the system and changes the whole thing, do you see? And you can use an illustration like DDT. Oh, well, we just put it in the machine, behind the tractor, the DDT is spread around the field, period, paragraph. No, no! The entire chain is involved, you see? And that's what we have been, just like the whole culture, we didn't have a Christian mind that was saying, now what's going on here? And because of the, I'm not relating it only to this, but because of the pietist hangover, I'm saying at the critical moment, even the Christians, apart from a very few, were unaware of this, because this wasn't the bit. The important thing was evangelism. How to evangelize a culture that's moving further and further away from the gospel? Well, do more evangelism. I'm exaggerating it, but there was the philanthropy, it was wonderful. But how about this? Isn't this important? And it really does feel like a tsunami has hit us. And with the financial thing, it's all related to this. Believe me, it's all related to this. The speed, et cetera, with which things are happening, the facility, the globalization, it's all part of this. Now, I can't possibly do justice to this huge subject, but what I'm trying to say is that here, in the beginning of the 19th century, you do begin to sense how it was affecting the churches in a very specific way. And I'm sorry to single out the evangelists every time, because they were by no means the only people involved in this. It was just a general assumption of the culture. These things are there, let's use them for the God's glory. And that is a legitimate thing to say. But you pick up already with Finney, you see, down here, in the early 1830s, you pick up on this idea of evangelism being something which is different from revivalism. See, the revivals of the Wesleys down here, 1638 and onwards, all in that period, they would just break out, preaching of the gospel, big crowds, people would be saved. Ah, say the early 19th century evangelists, and there were many of them. Billy Sunday was another. And I'm not trying to discredit them, do you understand, in terms of what the vision and the gospel that they were preaching and the good effect that it had in many, many ways. But what they didn't see was that the way they bought into the technology, having the possibility of access to more people than ever before, was actually just part of the way the culture was going. And because they didn't themselves emphasize the other side, they simply, by the other side I mean concern for the public, concern for the development of a Christian mind, etc., because everything was evangelism, it sort of sucked the whole church in behind this project. And it was kind of like running faster and faster in that particular mode, and not thinking of the whole. How is this going to affect family life, etc., etc.? So I think there was the development of a mindset which, by the time you get to the 20th century and up onto our own day, is so bizarre that when you look at the American church, and remember Neil Postman, I brought his 2 books in case any of you want to see them. Neil Postman describes the United States as a technopoly, a totalitarian technocracy, in other words, where the technology just governs the entire culture. And I'll read you a passage out of his book. And the evangelicals here, I think, just got caught up in this, so that, here's my point, by the end of the day, how is the church working within the church? Well, the church is working like a corporate organization, following all the same technical processes. And someone said to me just recently, a friend of mine, that in a meeting, one of the ministers of a large church in the States said, when you get above 1,000 people, it's got to work like a corporate machine. You see? How do you keep this thing afloat? Well, that's the only way you do it. Now, I then step back and say, okay, well, how does this relate to the New Testament? Where are all the priorities of the New Testament in this mentality? And just very simply, it's such a big thing. How can you make this, how can we see what's going on? The way I describe it is that the mindset has become, you've got a problem, develop a program. It's the mechanistic approach, you see, the mechanical, which is what the culture produced. Everything's swallowed up by the machine, you see, as it comes further and further. You've got a problem, work out a program, spelt Program. I think, please, I'm not trying to be rude, but this is where it's come from. I mean, Neil Postman just pouring out his heart over the tragedy of what's happened in a technopoly. So the situation is problem, program. And I can't tell you how deeply ingrained this has become in the modern West. Instead of, remember I talked to you about the Schaeffers. Problem, kneel on the floor, pray. Do you see? And the biblical model is, you've got a problem, you have to go to the personal, not to the mechanical. The mechanical is the denial of the image of God. We have to find solutions within the framework of the personal. Let me just read you these 2 sections out of Postman's first book in terms of technology. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death, written the year after 1984. He was deliberately relating it to Orwell's writing. And he says, when a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is redefined as a perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, when, in short, a people become an audience, and their public business and just think what we've watched the last week, their Public Business of Vaudeville Act, then a nation finds itself at risk. Culture death is a clear possibility. Culture death is a clear possibility. Then in the next page he goes on and he says, public consciousness has not yet assimilated the point that technology is ideology. And just prior to that he said, okay, there was no Communist Manifesto, there was no Mein Kampf, no one was sort of imposing this on it, but what was actually happening was that we were caught up in an ideology. The ideology is problem, program. Go to the machine's going to sort it out for you somehow. And then this is the section I want you to hear. This in spite of the fact that before our very eyes, technology has altered every aspect of life in America during the past 80 years. For example, it would have been excusable in 1905, remember I told you my father was born in 1906, it would have been excusable for us in 1905 to be unprepared for the cultural changes the automobile would bring. Who would have suspected that the automobile would tell us how we were to conduct our social and sexual lives, would reorient our ideas about what to do with our forests and cities, would create new ways of expressing our personal identity and social standing? But it is much later in the game now, and ignorance of the score is inexcusable. I was so struck, having been reading Neil Postman, to come across this quotation. This is a comment by Churchill, sort of off the cuff. He's writing about his great ancestor, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. And he's discussing the relative way people in that day, if you don't know this, but John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was instrumental in the defeat of Louis XIV. And as Churchill is writing about his great ancestor, he follows through this idea, well, were they more inhuman back there? They did this and this and this. Were they more inhuman than we are? Interesting question. And this is his conclusion. It is important to remember also the difference of feeling and outlook which separate the men and women of these times, that is the late 17th century, from ourselves. They gave a very big, indeed a dominating place in their minds to religion. It played as large a part in the life of the 17th century as sport does now. That's one of the first points he makes. Churchill, I don't think, was a believer. I'm quite sure he wasn't. One of their chief concerns was about the next world and how to be saved. Although ignorant compared with our standards, they were deeply versed in the Bible and prayer book. If they read few books, they studied them and digested them thoroughly. They had settled opinions on large questions of faith and doctrine and were often ready to die or suffer on account of the next one. Now here we come to it. Had they been absorbed or amused as we are today by the inexhaustible trivialities? Now, okay, then I went back to the beginning. Now, when did he write this? 1933. 1933. And you can see it comes out, because he doesn't even talk about media. He says, the inexhaustible trivialities of the day, had their sense been dulled by speed, sport, luxury, money-making, they could never have taken consciously the dire decisions without which England would not have been preserved. In these days, society was callous. Pain, when it came, was accepted as a familiar foe. Yet in some ways, our forerunners attached more importance to human life than we do in the final one. Although they fought duels and although death sentences were numerous, they would have recoiled in lively horror from the constant wholesale butcheries of scores of thousands of persons every year by motor cars. Quite apart from anything else the motor car is doing, it's actually killing people in the thousands. I mean, just think of pollution. And think of all the environmental factors. Churchill was sensing back there in 1933 that there was a problem, okay? Their faculties of wonder and indignation had not been blunted and worn away by the catalogues of atrocities and disasters. Just think of what we watch every day. Which the advantage of the electric telegraph, there it is, you see? The electric telegraph And the newspaper, that's as far as we've got, ladies and gentlemen. The Electric Telegraph and the newspaper placed at our disposal every morning and evening. Above all, they were not in a hurry. They made fewer speeches and lived more meditatively and more at leisure, with companionship rather than motion for their solace. They had fewer facilities than we have for the frittering away of thought, time, and life. Now just set that alongside. I mean, here's Neil Postman, just writing, within the last 12 years or so. And my point in showing you this is to say, do you see, this is what a Christian mind should have been like in relation to the virus of technique. It should have been asking the questions in the same way we ask, well, is it just to do such and such and such in society? And you say, no, it's not. Or is this the best method of education? Well, maybe not. Or should we allow immigrants to come in? Well, maybe not. And so on. All these questions, instead of thinking of technology as something to be considered that is actually debilitating our lives as over against just giving us benefits, there was no Christian mind in the sphere. And still, to my mind, not much. And so I suggest that we need to really think very carefully about where we are in this. One of the great prophets of this whole, what I call sensitivity to technology, is Marshall McLuhan. And this is the actual section from his obituary. Electronic media create a mosaic of simultaneous information which exerts the utmost pressure. These mechanical agencies must be combated. It is the medium that is the message. Now, we're all familiar with that. But have you seen how it ends? Because the medium created an environment that is indelible and lethal. Now, one of the things that's striking, and then the next, the previous ones, I find this very interesting, which is Morris Berman. This is, again, one of these summary statements that I think I've learnt by heart, but every one of us should have it. One could argue that corporate consumer culture is tantamount to a kind of nuclear attack on the human mind. I believe that's to be true. There's just such a volume. People are not able to think clearly. Do you remember what Churchill said back in 1933? They only had the telegraph and the newspaper. Okay, so here and I don't have any solutions, and we're going to just talk about a few before I close now. But we've got to start thinking about this, because what has happened is the church has become like the culture. There's no difference. And unless we shift gear on this, and our Christian mind starts to focus in on this, we will not produce, now this is relating it back to an earlier discussion, we will not produce the kind of communities that are likely to be welcoming and impressive and, attractive to people who are not Christians. And so we have to ask ourselves some questions. Well, if that is the case, a kind of nuclear attack, what am I doing to resist that attack? Next one, Gregor. Yeah, the three things are globalization, cybernetics, and deconstruction. You see, these are things which have been produced by our modern world. They've emerged, and they are making most Americans anxious and disoriented, for they inevitably lead to lives of emptiness and futility. I mean, I look out the window, that's what I see. You go around, empty, futile. And it's not simply the ideas, you see, the bankruptcy, morally, intellectually. It's also this other thing. And we have somehow, if we're going to make an impact on the society, we have to find little ways of living in a different environment that can really impact this, can speak to it. But this is a result of the whole movement from the Enlightenment, just working its way out. Cybernetics is the whole thing of computers, see. But there's one other of Morris Berman's, which I want you to, if you could pick it up for me, and I can read it. I am so struck. Here is a man who's not a Christian. He's looking at American culture. The Twilight of American Culture is the title of the book. And he says, actually, we've got to start thinking of the monastic option. Now, I just bring that in because if you think that's way off, let me first of all say, I am not advocating, nor is he advocating, a return to monasticism. Central to all these options is the rejection of a life based on kitsch, consumerism and profit, or on power, fame and self-promotion. Now, how much should the Christian be reflecting that? So here's a non-Christian writing this, you see? The rejection of all of that. The monastic option now needs to be a way of life. Here's a non-Christian writing about our culture and saying that. But lest you think this is far-fetched, Benedict started the monastic movement. He wasn't the first monk, but he started a movement back 525, early 6th century, which has affected the whole world. In fact, when John Roberts wrote and made his documentary series called the Triumph of the West, 1984 I think it was, he actually takes you back to Benedict. He says Europe, the Triumph of the West, began here, and he takes you to Monticello and the monastic community that he had down there. And his point is just this. His point is, when he says the monastic option, that little community lived in a different way that was so powerful that it was able to change the whole of pagan Europe. Do you get the point? Now, this doesn't look like an easy solution which we should adopt because it's going to take so long. But actually, we have no other option, particularly with the culture the way it is. So I would just like to end. The way I summarize it is like this. We've got to see these weaknesses, the pietist hangover, the virus of technique, see that we're all of us caught up in this in some way. The church has got to hear this and be serious about it and do something about it. But it's got to be us. Where do we start? So you remember earlier when Joanne said about, well, is this material around? And I said, well, let's produce it. And let's start thinking ourselves and start something that we will be able to make a difference. But I've just summarized what it should look like, because you can get into a situation of ridiculousness where you say, well, you've got 2 cars, well, you should give one up. You've got a fridge, well, you should give up a fridge. They didn't need them, and so on and so forth. And that is just a silliness. So one can't talk about details like that. One can only talk about principles. And here is how I've summarized them for myself. They all begin with C. To focus, first of all, on character, not comfort. You see, one of the themes that you get from the Industrial Revolution onwards is how can we make life more comfortable? Well, you know what? You could get from here to Murrayfield in 5 minutes if you had a motor car. Well, that's a very, very attractive offer. Peter and I came down on the bus, and we had to stand outside, and it was a bit chilly. But I was deliberately coming on the bus, do you see? Now, I'm not then saying that you shouldn't have a motor car. I'm just saying that if we started to think like this, because the impact, and incidentally, Ford himself realized way ahead that what he had done might actually be negative to the culture. The mobility was going to break down community. When you go past these massive supermarkets, where do you think they came from? They came from America, of course. But they came from the automobile. You don't want to get out of the automobile and walk down the street with your box and you've got to carry all this heavy stuff. Oh, you just drive in. It's so simple. What is the consequence? Do you see what I'm saying? And that's why I used that quote from Churchill. He was thinking about this. There are consequences here. The article in the paper yesterday I read when I arrived. Be kind to your child. This is the headline. Be kind to your child. Take away the television. Now, how could we laugh? But, I mean, seriously. Not one of my children will have a television in their house. They just look at it, see the effects of this in the long haul. Where do you think this trivia, the Vaudeville Act, comes from? In the most powerful culture in nation in the world. A vaudeville act? You know, I mean, that's really basically what it is. So we really have to take this seriously. So in relation to comfort, you've got to think, wow, wait, now some big things are involved here. And the main thing is focusing on the development of character. That's what the New Testament focuses on, to become like Christ. That's what it's about. Now, I was having a tussle in my Bible study Thursday morning because I'm in some of the people around me saying, well, it's just gospel ministry. So Paul talks about, and we're partners in the gospel. What do you think that means? Oh, it means evangelism. And the whole context he's talking about, and I pray that your love may increase more and more. Do you see what I mean? You know, the mindset we have is just automatically to read the word gospel as evangelism. Now, there are many times when that is the connection. And I'm not trying to break it, okay? I'm just saying it's not the whole story. And so character, the church has got to take it seriously. The only way we can have character is as we serve and then we face the difficulties of the culture, of the world in which we live. And we are transformed. Instead of trying to change the whole world, we ourselves are transformed. We've got to be like that. Character, not comfort. That is our model. Character, not comfort. The second is community. You see how it's closely related. Not commuting. Community cannot come into being if everyone's commuting around the place. They're two totally exclusive. So you have this phenomenon in the States of going along as I did not too long ago, and here's a 6,000 member church. I don't know what people think about that, but I mean, it's wonderful that you've got 6,000 people who are Christians in the church. But in terms of community, and the culture is looking on and saying, where is this phony, phony, phony? Everything's phony. The political world's phony, the media is phony, and where's the reality? So we have people getting in the automobile, so the automobile park is so big you could land an airplane on it. I'm not joking. I walked around it. And it's where's community? And what does the New Testament speak of? Just page after page after page, assuming that we're going to be living in a relationship with one another, our neighbors, Christian, non-Christian, no. But there's real community. How can you have community in this kind of a world? Now, you see how radical this is, and difficult. That's why I say, man, there are no easy solutions. But unless we recognize that the virus of technique has been there, and that we have just been walking along with this and making our churches operate like corporations and so on, unless we recognize that, we're not going to get a solution. The final one is confrontation, not accommodation. Confrontation. Meaning by that the solid rock under our feet is the Word of God, which is true. And because it is true, it's taking us in a totally different direction to the culture, which says there is no truth, so how can you possibly make a judgment on anyone? And we have the uncomfortable responsibility of living in a culture with all these things that I've said and saying, I'm sorry, at the end of the day, this is true. I'm not sorry. You know, I'm glad it's true. But it's going to mean we're going to have a discussion about this. And that's not going to be pleasant. I might say some things which would hurt you. And we have to do it in an environment that is very human and gentle and so on. But with just like our forefathers, Luther, this highly emotional man, you know, deep feeling, standing there in front of the emperor and saying, or the emperor's representative, I can't remember which one, and saying, here I stand, I can do no other. You know? And then I believe, going back to where I started, this vacuum would respond if it saw people living like that. Yeah. That with these 3 C's that I've described, okay, they're just a little shorthand, but not buying in either to the pietist hangover where you say, you know, well, I'm working, and the only reason why I work is so that I can get money to the church. God, Elizabeth Fry, all the pioneers in our Christian heritage who did things in all kinds of areas, the medical profession, because they believed that what they did was under the authority of Christ and for his glory, as well as the evangelism. So we've got to deal with that, and then secondly, we have to somehow struggle together praying. This is what we should pray for, is revival in these areas, is that we would start to live in a much more discerning way about the culture in which we are.